Gentlemen, which of you would like to start first?
I yield the floor.
All right, Ben. We'll start with you. 5 minutes on the clock and go.
Sure. So it seems to me that given where things stand right now, since right, like if you look at the shape of the election, the fact that that thus far Tulsi Gabbard hasn't been able to get a single delegate seems unlikely to, but seems very likely to be a spoiler and to take delegates away from Bernie Sanders. Certainly, if you look at the few thousand votes that he won New Hampshire by versus the 10,000 votes that Tulsi got there, it seems to me that if we're looking at somebody like Pete Buttigieg, Joe Biden, one of these ghouls becoming the Democratic nominee, potentially becoming president, potentially starting new wars, for there to be a justification for Tulsi's candidacy, for her to continue being in the race rather than doing what she did in 2016 and endorse Bernie Sanders, then she needs to be not only better than Bernie Sanders on foreign policy, certainly, which since that seems to be the primary justification for her candidacy is the foreign policy justification. But she needs to be so much better that it's night and day, so much better that the slim chance of Tulsi somehow turning this around is worth the danger of throwing the race to some monster like Buttigieg or Bloomberg. And I've got to say, I'm not seeing it, right? So even leaving aside the domestic policy issues, of which Sanders is clearly better, if you look at the healthcare section of Tulsi's website, sounds a whole lot more like what Pete's saying, or like what Biden is saying than what Bernie's saying. There's definitely an attempt at triangulation there between Medicare for all and that Medicare for all who want it sort of approach, at least in the way she's expressing it there. But meanwhile, when it comes to her signature issue about war and peace, it seems to me that whereas it's certainly true that neither of these people are Noam Chomsky, right? Which is obviously what I would want, probably what you would want. These are both people who are somewhere in between what we would want and what you get in Washington, D.C. and with the Democratic establishment. They both have serious flaws about this stuff. So certainly Bernie's vote for the intervention in Kosovo, which I protested against, and I haven't changed my mind, is a black mark on his record. But it seems to me that you can't point to a single example of a foreign intervention that Bernie Sanders supported and that Tulsi Gabbard opposed, which by itself really seems to me that it takes the feet from under the foreign policy argument for the continued existence of the Gabbard candidacy, even aside from the fact that Tulsi has a lot of foreign policy negatives that are not shared by Bernie Sanders. And I'm not talking about some ridiculous smear about her being a Russian agent or, saying that she loves Assad or anything like that. I'm talking about her very bad stance for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, on the Iran nuclear deal, which is one of the most important peace issues of our time, which she was certainly at least initially opposed to, and even some of the good votes that she cast on it, she expressed a lot of ambivalence about. I'm talking about the fact that she at least waffled on torture. Neither of these things are true about Bernie Sanders. I'm talking about the fact that she actually said that the United States should be doing more counter-terrorist bombing in Syria. I'm talking about the fact that she has said the words, she's a dove on regime change wars, but she's a hawk on the war on terror. I don't think Bernie Sanders has said that. I'm talking about the fact that Bernie Sanders has never gone on Fox News to say that it's a problem that Barack Obama wasn't using the magical incantation words radical Islamic terrorism.
30 seconds.
Because if he had, that would apparently have some sort of positive effect on terrorism, or gone on Islamophobe Bill Maher's show to talk about how ridiculous it was to talk about material causes and poverty and their role in terrorism. In all these respects, Bernie Sanders actually seems like the superior peace candidate to me.
All right, 5 minutes on the clock to you, Niko.
All right. So if we're going to talk about who is best equipped to run the country and best equipped to stay in the race, in the issue, of course, of whether or not Tulsi should be dropped out will be addressed. But I want to talk about who's best equipped. I would think we would break it down in 3 categories, right? Foreign policy, domestic policy, and the conviction to see those policies through. If you want to talk about domestic policy, a lot of people will claim that there is some clear advantage in Bernie Sanders' behalf. And although he is great when it comes to some issues on domestic policy, and I would even argue better than Tulsi on some, he is not the clear favorite. Because at the end of the day, Bernie does like to talk about the symptoms and what would be great, but never actually expresses any desire to see those policies through. For example, Tulsi Gabbard has introduced the Securing America's Elections Act, which actually includes not only voter verified paper ballots, but blockchain technology and open source software, so that if someone did try to rig it after the ballots were counted, we would actually be able to backtrack and figure out exactly how it was done. Although this legislation was introduced in 2017, Bernie Sanders does not co-introduce this legislation in the Senate. Actually, he backed Klobuchar's bill, which was just a money grab by neoliberals, and it would give power to the various state governments and just give them money for no reason. It's just like, hey, if you try to do some things that we like, we'll give you some money, but it does not get rid of the voter machines. In fact, that creates a monopoly. If we want to see any of Bernie and Tulsi's policies passed, I think that we all agree that we have to be able to get people like an AOC, Rashida Tlaib, and Ilhan Omar in power, and we can't do that without a secure election system. So when you want to talk about domestic policy, we can look at that. Or we can talk about the OFF Act, which is the Off Fossil Fuels Act, which is the most aggressive climate change legislation endorsed by over 400 climate and environmental organizations. It is the most aggressive climate legislation, not only in the United States, but actually around the world. And yet, once again, even though this legislation was first introduced in 2017 and then again later, Bernie Sanders did not introduce that. Instead, he's introducing a Green New Deal plan that hasn't actually fruitized into a bill yet. However, he's also one of the ones, like many of his supporters, who say, well, climate change can't wait. Well, Tulsi agreed, and that's why she started doing this a while ago. When we're talking about triangulation, did Bernie ignore this and the Securing America's Elections Act for triangulation, or because he doesn't care? I would argue that it's probably triangulation and political calculation. So not only, once again, are we addressing, and I can go on for days about other domestic policies that Tulsi has been far and away better on, but if you want to once again talk about the conviction, which is part of what we would like to see in a president, especially one that we would consider a progressive ally, it's are you going to triangulate because you have a chance to win and you don't want to give any shine even to allies on issues that I think you and I will both consider existential, or are you going to do the right thing? That's really what it comes down to. Now we can talk about foreign policy, and that's honestly it's a walk-off home run. See, I'm more than willing to admit that Tulsi has not been perfect, and prior to 2015, I took a lot of issue with a lot of the things that she had done. But they were honestly no different than any of the things that Bernie had done up until that point. They both had very similar missteps. Now, if you want to go past 2015, then we would ask, because everybody likes to call Tulsi a hawk on terror and also likes to bring up Syria, why was it that in 2015, Tulsi tried to end the war in Syria by introducing a bill and Bernie was silent on it? In fact, instead, he took the opposite approach. He said that we had to get rid of Assad. That's what he said. Now, we know what that means. That's regime change war. Now, even with all of Tulsi's missteps in one form or another, in 2011, Bernie Sanders introduced a resolution that ended up leading to the overthrow of Gaddafi. And in fact, in the 2016 debates, Hillary Clinton had to remind him that he did it. And unfortunately, that has actually been a pattern for Bernie Sanders, where he will say, I don't want to go into a quagmire, but then spew every attempt to manufacture consent by demonizing the leader that is being discussed at the time for whatever country it may be. And of course, that eventually ends up leading to the overthrow of that leader, sending a country into chaos. Now, that mistake by Bernie Sanders and the rest of the senators who co-sponsored that legislation led to literal open market slavery in Libya. And Tulsi has never, ever made a mistake that has led to something like that. Not only did she try to end the war in Syria in 2015, but she actually did it again during this election. And of course, there was nowhere to be found.
30 seconds.
Even though she literally teed it up so that everybody can knock it out the park, because she even used Trump's words to prove that we shouldn't be there. When we want to look at the overall message of foreign policy, which is, it's not about quote unquote good and bad. It's about diplomacy and making sure that we're trying to pursue peace. But there is some pragmatism involved. But that pragmatism does not mean demonizing leaders in front of the entire world just so we can try to get score some cool points and then try to pretend like you're going to be able to be diplomatic with them after you actually become the commander-in-chief.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, so we'll start the back and forth with you, Ben Burgis, and then try to keep it, I guess, within the 1 to 2 minutes. But then I'll just let you guys free flow unless you start talking over each other too much, and then we'll get this going for let's say 30 minutes. All right.
Mm-hmm.
All right. The Libya thing is just not true. That's 100% false. What Bernie Sanders voted for was the unanimous. The unanimous, I think, passed by consent thing to do two things. One was call on the United Nations to establish a no-fly zone to try to de-escalate the situation, and two, calling on Gaddafi to resign. Equating this, as Hillary Clinton dishonestly did in the 2016 debates, with supporting the U.S. intervention to overthrow Gaddafi, is just dishonest. Those are just two very different things, Niko. That's so let's be real about this. This is not what Bernie Sanders did not lead to slave markets in Libya. Bernie Sanders never supported U.S. intervention in Libya. That is just 100%, 1,000% false. Also, I have no idea why we're cutting off in 2015. That is a hopelessly arbitrary cutoff point that leaves out lots and lots of relevant history that is very illustrative of the difference between them.
Okay, so first of all, that's actually, if we look at 2016, Hillary Clinton talked about establishing a no-fly zone in Syria, and all the generals said that would be absolutely insane, because everyone knows, if you have any military background or foreign policy background, that establishing a no-fly zone is declaring war. That is exactly what that is. A general came out and said it, and every Bernie supporter was like, yeah, that's why we can't do it. And now, because Bernie Sanders is asking for a no-fly zone, we're going to pretend like that definition changed in 2011. But when Hillary Clinton said it in 2016, the generals had a different, well, no, they had the same thing in 2011, 2016. It's the same thing. It's declaring war, essentially. Now, I hear your point about, oh, well, consent, and we're being nice about saying we would like for you to. That's not really what that resolution means. And we know that what that verbiage actually has meant effectively, historically, just like the AUMF. But we're not going to actually use military force. What we're trying to do is ask Saddam to be nice. That's what we're going to do. And then we ended up with a bunch of troops on the ground. And Bernie Sanders also supported the AUMF and actually admitted that Barbara Lee was the only one in the entire House of Representatives and the Senate that actually got that right. And it was the same type of rhetoric. Yeah, it sounds good. Yes, you would hope that it would lead to the actions that you or I would interpret from reading that legislation, but that is not what actually happens, and we cannot ignore the effects, the actual effects of these pieces of legislation. Now, at the end of the day, the reason I chose 2015 and beyond is because, like I said, before 2015, there's almost no separation between Bernie and Tulsi. Unfortunately, they both voted to give weapons to the Ukrainian neo-Nazis, not knowing, well, Tulsi explained that to me that she didn't know they were neo-Nazis at the time, but they both voted for it. Before that, they both voted in one way or another to support the war on terror. But after that, Tulsi seemed to experience some evolution, whereas Bernie began to double down based on whatever establishment narrative was being put into the mainstream so that he did not alienate some parts of his neoliberal centrist and even sometimes neoconservative base. Whether you want to look at the demonization of Assad, the demonization of Maduro, saying that, oh, we're not talking about that evil Latino socialism during the debate. We're talking about that Canadian and Scandinavian socialism, which is actually has some racial undertones that I was not really happy about. But either way, if you want to talk about foreign policy, there has to be some evolution at this point. And unfortunately, when you're looking at Russiagate and his rhetoric there, when you're looking at how he talks about Maduro, but he can't seem to see the similarities between Maduro and Evo Morales, but he hates Evo Morales, even though Evo Morales endorsed Maduro. Like when you're looking at how he talks about Assad and then double down on this chemical weapons nonsense, when you're looking at how he talks about Kim Jong-un, when you're looking at, even though he is, he can get a little problematic, but he's not using rhetoric that is conducive to diplomacy that a commander-in-chief would have to engage in order to bring peace to not only their regions, but around the world. And that's the difference between him and Tulsi in that regard.
All right.
Can I make my next? Can I ask you a question?
You can ask me a question
give Ben a chance to respond to all that, because that
you
was a
can
lot
ask
of
me a
information.
question after I respond to the 20 of the things you just said that were true. So first of all, there's absolutely no comparison between the purely symbolic toothless resolution that Bernie Sanders went along with on Libya and the authorization for the use of military force. That's an absurd comparison. The authorization of the use of military force, as the name might lead you to expect, authorized the United States to use military force. There was no authorization of the United States to use force in Libya in the resolution calling on the UN, not the US, to establish a no-fly zone in very different circumstances than the ones in Syria in 2016, and calling on Gaddafi to resign. No calls on foreign leaders to resign have not led to wars for regime change. It takes a whole lot more to lead to that than calling on someone to resign. You can, in fact, people call on foreign leaders to resign all the time. The idea that Bernie Sanders has neoliberal centrist and neoconservative elements to his base is so obviously news from an alternate dimension that I'm staggered to hear it. That's just not, I think you could ask 1,000 people who, well, not 1,000 people on the street, but 1,000 people who follow the news, and 1,000 of them would look at you like you were insane if you said that. That's just not the case. As far as now, I agree. As Sanders has acknowledged, his vote for the authorization of the use of military force after 9/11, was a mistake. He shouldn't have done that. On the other hand, bringing that up to contrast Tulsi with Bernie, which is the issue here, right? Is the comparative choice is absurd, considering that Tulsi Gabbard was not in a position to vote one way or the other on it. You might as well give Bernie Sanders credit for not having voted for U.S. involvement in World War I. So all of that is just very false. And let's also look at Bernie Sanders' actual look. If you want to talk about 2015 to the present, let's talk about 2015 to the present. In 2015 to the present, as you said earlier, that people on my side of this love to talk about Tulsi as a hawk in the war on terror. That's a quote from Tulsi. She calls herself a hawk in the war on terror. That's not me making that up. That's her. And she continues to trumpet her decision to join the military after 9/11 in a way that certainly suggests that she still thinks that was a good thing. That was a good thing to do compared to conscientious objector Bernie Sanders. Finally, again, if you want to look at 2015 to the present, and 2015 to the present, Bernie Sanders has swung way to the left on foreign policy. If you compare where he was in the 2016 election to where he is in this election, he has dramatically reconnected to 80s Bernie in this election cycle. You brought up Maduro, and whereas I do have criticisms of his answer in that debate, I co-wrote an article with Michael Brooks that's in Jackman about that, if you want to know what my criticisms are. But we also have to remember that Bernie Sanders took a lot of heat for refusing to call Maduro a dictator and refusing to say that Juan Guaido was the legitimate president of Venezuela. If you think that his statement was still too critical, frankly, I think there are, in fact, lots of things the Democratic Socialists should criticize Maduro for. You don't, use being diplomatic can't be an all-purpose excuse, for having a black and white view of these things and not making appropriate criticisms. But even in 2016, when he wasn't nearly as good at foreign policy as he has been in 2020, in a debate in Miami. Because after I finished, I saw that my screen was frozen. And I was like, "Oh my god! Did I just throw that myself?"
Well, that's why I better text him. I wonder if he's still talking, even though all of us are like, "Oh, where did Ben go?" Talking to no one. All right, so you were talking for a while there, Ben. Do you want to maybe close out like for 30 seconds and then give Niko a chance to respond?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Yeah. So I think I think that if you look at the trajectory of Bernie's foreign policy positions, I think that he's always had good instincts. I think that in 2016 he was much more cautious and he didn't really seem to have found his voice on it. Although even though there are very good moments like the one in Miami, and in 2020 he seems to have a much more aggressive anti-interventionist message.
All right. So first of all, I wouldn't actually argue with you that Bernie has moved left on his foreign policy. You know, I'm happy to see that. It's something I've given him a lot of credit for as a Bernie supporter still, and as a former Bernie supporter in 2016. But like at the end of the day, it does take more than words, right? And we can't ignore Bernie's inaction when we've had examples of legislation which he could have fervently pushed as much as he's pushed, once again, some neoliberal legislation, not necessarily regarding foreign policy, but just in general, because it has a good brand attached to it, where they aren't in his direct competition. For example, we have the No More Presidential Wars Act, which was introduced by Tulsi Gabbard, which was put in the NDAA. Now, here's the thing. Democrats were the one who stripped the No More Presidential War Act when when Donald Trump sent it back down, which is the first time in history we've seen the NDAA just pushed, voted on, passed, and then stripped of something like that had to do with foreign policies. Never happened before. Now, this is a big deal, and Tulsi spoke about it. It was actually in the news, and yet Bernie was silent on this. If Bernie was, as serious as he claims to be about making sure that we don't have Donald Trump violating every single, constitutional amendment or the Bill of Rights, for example, that just a certain amount of power to him and a certain amount of power to Congress. Tulsi was trying to uphold that, but instead Bernie, he kind of introduces the resolution after the fact, but Tulsi tried to prevent it before any of this happened. Once again, this didn't just start in 2019 when Tulsi started running for office. She first introduced the No More Presidential Wars Act in her last congressional term. So she introduced it twice to Bernie's silence. And when once again, we don't see that in the reverse. If Bernie introduces some revolutionary legislation, Tulsi Gabbard shows the conviction to stand by her principles, regardless of whether or not it could hurt her personal political prospects. We can look at the Stop Financing Terrorism Act, and this is something I want to address regarding this whole dove on peace and hawk on terror nonsense that people keep harping on and kind of creating their own definition based off of whatever they associated the idea of being a hawk on terrorism with in the past. Tulsi is not the type of person that is hip to certain lingo, right? So when she hears the word hawk on terror or hawk on anything, she's like, oh, it just means that you're persistent in making sure it doesn't exist. That's actually what she meant. Now, if you want to know how she is a hawk on terror, you can look at the Stop Arming Terrorism Act, which says, hey, Donald Trump, not only do we need to stop arming terrorists, but we need to make sure we stop giving money to Saudi Arabia, who we know is going to continue to arm terrorists. We need to make sure we're not giving money to Pakistan, who we know is going to continue to arm terrorists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it isn't like she's saying authorize some military force to go stop terrorism. What she said is the opposite. Hey, how about we just stop doing everything that we are doing to ensure terrorism exists in the Middle East and instead cut them off at the bank account? And that's something that Tulsi tried to get done. And when it failed, it was because of the Democrats and not the Republicans. Surprisingly enough, she worked with Republicans to get this stuff introduced. And yet Bernie's inaction there, when he has such a vast movement, I think all of us would agree his movement is vast and far reaching. His inaction led to that type of legislation dying in silence. We cannot pretend like this has no real life implications, not only for how we should perceive Bernie's conviction when it comes to foreign policy, but how he'll handle it when he gets in the House. It seems like his brand, to a certain degree, when it comes to his foreign policy or when it comes to his domestic policy, is more important to him than the actual acts of making sure that we have principled stances that foundationally change the way we govern in foreign policy. Let's call out the issues at the roots, not just, oh, I'm gonna get, like, once again, I'm gonna get Evo Morales right, but I'll get Maduro wrong, and I'll get Assad wrong. And it seems like he's basing he gets Lula right? How you get Lula, Evo right, but then Maduro wrong or Assad wrong? And then for what you said about Gaddafi, once again, we can't pretend like this no-fly zone doesn't mean what it is. I'm just saying militarily, a no-fly zone is essentially declaring war, even if you're asking the United Nations to do it. And you knew what that was going to lead to. And for the most part, I want to be very clear about this as well. There's a little bit of a nonchalant attitude about calling for the resignation of Gaddafi when clearly there is a lot of misconceptions about what took place there. Like for the fact that we are financing terrorism through a regime that we propped up in Chad to push where they used terrorists to invade Libya, and then when Libya was ultimately forced to respond, they would say that he was attacking his own people, which was a lie. And I can imagine how anybody would react if we tried to call for using a resolution which is basically guised as a threat, a threat guised as a resolution. If we try to call for the overthrow of the resignation of the EU, the overthrow of the resignation of the chairman of the United Nations, and then if he didn't comply, we just send soldiers after him, because that's essentially what we did to Gaddafi in Libya. We called for the resignation of the elected chair of the African Union, which is oftentimes not discussed, even though it's a very important piece of this equation. And when he actually offered to step down, that is when we did what we did. So in other words, when we're manufacturing this consent that Bernie Sanders absolutely engaged in regards to Libya, we are setting up for what took place with Gaddafi, and once again, what led to an open slave market. When we're manufacturing consent for Assad, you have people who automatically believe that the Syrian chemical weapons attacks actually happened, at least within the last 2 years. And it turned out the OPCW leak completely debunked that. And Tulsi was the only one who had the clairvoyance to get that right. When we're talking about Iran, both Tulsi and Bernie actually got Iran right. But I'll take it even a step further, that Tulsi predicted that we cannot trust anything this administration says about Iran, because they will absolutely lie in order to manufacture consent to go to war with Iran. So the oil tanker situation, Iran, Soleimani being responsible for thousands of United States soldiers' deaths, which is a lie, because we've only lost a few thousand soldiers overseas. And so that would mean that he would at least be responsible for at least half of them, which is nonsensical. That all these things and more is exactly why you just can't pretend that Bernie is even close to Tulsi, because it takes more than just the right words at the right time when everybody is watching. It takes a certain amount of clairvoyance. It takes a certain amount of principle, and it does take a certain amount of evolution that I would admit both of them have experienced, but Tulsi's evolution seems to have led her to action rather than just pretty words right in the middle of a presidential election. Now, I do have a question for you. I think especially after Iowa, all of us would agree that there is clearly an election integrity issue. I've seen more people being more willing to call out what is obvious. There should be absolutely no reason that Pete Buttigieg is a delegate ahead of Bernie Sanders, and I think that you would agree with that, especially with him winning the popular vote. But Tulsi once again tried to address this issue in 2017 with the Securing America's Elections Act. How can we be sure that Bernie is going to do the right thing when he's president, when every single president in history has moved, right? And I don't think this would be different for Bernie or Tulsi. But Tulsi has already introduced legislation to make sure that what happened to Bernie didn't happen to him, and yet he was silent. If he doesn't take election integrity seriously, how are we going to get that, use that people power, as he always talks about, to get the people that he needs in the legislature to do what he wants to do? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, so first of all, I think that the idea that the Tulsi resolution was the good resolution, the one to award grants to the states to work on election integrity, is the bad one. I'm not at all sure about that. I also think that with a lot of these resolutions that you're talking about, it's important. If you're talking about Tulsi sponsoring a resolution that has tons of co-sponsors and might actually become law and seems like a good thing to exert political capital on, that's one thing. If you're talking about, symbolically introducing a resolution that you don't particularly expect to go anywhere and then using it as a litmus test.
You mean like Medicare for all?
Whether other people co-sponsor it, then I think that it is exactly backwards. It's exactly backwards to say, oh, pretty words are one thing, but co-sponsoring this meaningless symbolic, this meaningless resolution that I don't expect to go anywhere that I introduced for show is another. No, that is pretty words. If you want to talk about actually getting something done that's more significant, obviously it was vetoed, so we can say that maybe as a matter of degree, it's not as different as for this as we'd hope. But I certainly think that we're a lot closer to the realm of getting stuff done in real life when you talk about Bernie Sanders spearheading the effort to invoke the War Powers Resolution to stop the United States from being involved in the genocidal Saudi war in Yemen. Which
that was
is
actually Tulsi.
Which is nobody. That was Bernie Sanders.
No, that was Tulsi.
No,
Go ahead.
okay.
I don't want
First,
to interrupt you. Go ahead. I'm
well,
sorry. Go
okay.
ahead.
Well, that was Bernie Sanders. There is no doubt or ambiguity about this. This is Bernie. This is, first of all, this is the Senate doing it. Secondly, which Tulsi Gabbard is not in the Senate. And yeah, it was, buddy. So it was the Senate, and they have and that was Bernie Sanders leading the charge on that. Tulsi had led the charge; it wouldn't have gone anywhere. That's how you know. Now, that is a hell of a lot closer to getting something done in the real world as opposed to pretty words. And in fact, on the subject of the genocidal Saudi war in Yemen, Tulsi has been extremely unhelpful because she has repeated and spread a lot of propagandistic lies about the Houthi fighters in Yemen just being tools of Iran. She constantly talks about Iran as a state sponsor of terror and how concerned we should be about it. Doesn't seem to be a lot of concerns about being diplomatic there. And in fact,
can you give an example of something she said recently?
You said both of them got Iran right, and in fact, they did not get Iran right. The single most important issue with Iran since Tulsi has been in political life, Bernie Sanders got right, Tulsi Gabbard got wrong, and that was the Iran deal. So let's talk about that. So the Iran deal, she said. So when it was first negotiated, she said that she had grave concerns about it. She voted in favor of a Republican favored piece of legislation called the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act of 2015. That's even within your time frame, 2015, that gave the Republican Congress more power to derail the agreement. Was opposed by Obama, but she supported that. Now she did flip flop later and vote for a completely symbolic resolution defending the Iran deal. But she spent a lot of time going on Fox News expressing her concerns. Her concerns about Iran, and that is not at all true of Bernie Sanders. In fact, Bernie Sanders is one of two people in the Senate who voted against new sanctions on Iran, which all the other Democrats voted for because it was packaged together with sanctions on Russia. Bernie is the only person who cared enough about defending the Iran deal to vote against that. Also, while we're talking about votes, it's just absolutely crucial not to accept this deceptive conflation of the vote to call on Gaddafi to resign. You said, okay, but it's backed up by sending soldiers. Yeah, but there was a separate vote on that, and he voted no. That is a crucial distinction that I think we really can't let go. Just like we can't let go the fact that Tulsi again has a history of waffling on torture. Bernie does not. Tulsi has a history of attacking Obama from the right for not using the term radical Islamic terrorism. Tulsi has a history of mocking the idea that poverty has anything to do with inspiring terrorism, and none of these things are true of Bernie Sanders. So if we're going to have a comparison, we really need to look at the whole period where they were both in public life.
All right, so I want to go ahead and address a couple of things. First of all, the whole waffling on torture thing, she doesn't have a history of it. You're talking about the one video that literally everyone talks about, where she actually explained very clearly that she actually hadn't seen the report yet. And so if you look at her history, you want to look at the actions that she had when she had the power to vote. And she's actually voted unilaterally against terrorism in any form while she's been in the House of Representatives. So you can talk about that one video, or we could do it as you suggested, which is look at her history. And her history showed that she has been avidly unilaterally against terrorism every single time she's had a chance to vote. And that's something that no amount of rhetoric can change. Now let's talk about the whole Yemen situation. I think that you and I might have we've been looking at two different time periods, because I'm not just talking about the last year during the election. I'm talking about, again, since 2017. It was actually Tulsi Gabbard and Ro Khanna, even though I'm not a fan of Ro Khanna, but it was actually Tulsi Gabbard and Ro Khanna who led that effort. And then Bernie did eventually join in. And Tulsi actually came out and told the world, hey, Trump is using Saudi Arabia to finance terrorism in Yemen to commit this genocide. And that was one of the reasons, because she was introducing this or leading this effort by coupling it with the No More Presidential Wars Act and coupling it with the Stop Arming Terrorism Act and Stop Financing Terrorism Act, that I know for a fact that she was one of the ones leading the charge on this, because she introduced legislation to do something about it alongside the No More War or End the War in Yemen resolution that you were referring to with Bernie Sanders. Now, as you know, there wasn't just one piece of legislation introduced regarding Yemen, but there was two, because Trump ended up vetoing the first one. But Tulsi introduced peripheral legislation to couple with that, once again showing that I'm not just going to try and pretend like Yemen is the only issue that we have where genocide is being committed because the United States is engaging in the financing of terrorism, but I'm going to make sure that this situation that happens in Yemen doesn't ever happen again to anybody, as long as we can do something about it. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the whole poverty doesn't have anything to do with terrorism that you're claiming she said, which I might have missed. I'm not going to say call you a liar on it, but I would probably be willing to admit that it was probably, once again, before 2015, because anything that you've heard from her in the last, I don't know, 2 to 3 years, is saying, hey, maybe we should stop pursuing terrorism under the guise of defending the United States and, making sure that we're taking care of our national security, because she says what we're doing is creating propaganda for terrorists and terrorist organizations. She's been the one who said that more than anyone. And once again, she even does the Democrats a favor by throwing them another softball, and it is Trump. And she'll say it is Trump who was giving Saudi Arabia this money to finance terrorism, giving Pakistan this money to finance terrorism, and then no one actually co-signs. Now, if you want to talk about this whole idea that, oh, well, Tulsi's, meaningless legislation wasn't going to do anything in his teethless resolution, that's not true. I just told you. The No More Presidential Wars Act was in the NDAA, and the Democrats killed it. The Democrats. And if Bernie would have said something, then we know for 100% fact that the people who voted against it would have been blasted. I mean, let's be honest, Cory Booker's career completely ended before he could even get his election started, because he voted against Bernie's pharmaceutical legislation, and that bill didn't even pass. So to pretend like this bill didn't have any teeth is nonsensical. It's ludicrous, and it's just it's an attempt to delegitimize Tulsi's legitimate work. But not even looking at history to compare it to. Like once again, Bernie calling people out has led to them being hurt politically in the long term for the rest of their career. And if we want to talk about meaningless legislation, if Tulsi didn't co-sponsor the Medicare for All Act by Jayapal in the House, knowing that it was going to fail in both the House and the Senate, she would be getting ate alive for the entire election. Now, granted, she wants to introduce her own plan because she is running for president. Let's be clear. I would have ate her alive for not co-sponsoring that, or if she tried to co-sponsor that and then do like what Ro Khanna did, which is co-sponsor some other nonsensical public option legislation. No, Bernie's legislation was not going to get passed in the Senate. It was basically just proving, hey, I'm still about this Medicare for all business. And I don't consider that meaningless, because it continues to drive the conversation forward and holds people to account when you don't join in on that movement. Saying that it's meaningless and that Bernie shouldn't have talked about the No More Presidential Wars Act would be saying that would be, it doesn't really hold water when you consider the fact that Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, Cory Booker all co-sponsored the Medicare for All back because of how it would look in the public politically while they were running for president. So we can't say that just because something won't pass, that means it's meaningless. That's nonsensical. So overall, I just think that you have this idea that if we just say something, then it's just true. Like if we assert it and it vibes with what I believe as far as Bernie Sanders is concerned, it's true. And if Tulsi introduces it, it's meaningless. But if she doesn't introduce it, then she's worthless. and that she is not allowed to experience evolution, but Bernie absolutely is allowed to experience an evolution. And since we're going to talk about evolution, I would like to go ahead and talk about the issue on Israel and Palestine. Now, I would like to say that I don't really vibe with Bernie or Tulsi on Palestine. I'm a little bit to the left of both of them in that regard. But just as early as 2017, Bernie Sanders said, he was asked on Al Jazeera, well, if there could be a one-state solution where both Israelis and Palestinians had equal rights, which I think a lot of people would agree with, would you be okay with them both having equal rights? He said, no, I wouldn't, because that would mean the end of the Jewish people of Israel. That to believe that would mean that you inherently believe that Muslims are violent. And I know a lot of people get freaked out when that can't be true. No. Yes. He did say that, and I'm not going to lie, it made me a little sick to my stomach. It was in a popularized interview by Al Jazeera, but the only thing that's actually talked about in the Al Jazeera clip is when he voted or he pushed that resolution that was started by Republicans that went to the United Nations to not participate in BDS in any way. But the rest of that interview was actually scary. And that, once again, I include in foreign policy. Now, granted, he said he would withhold aid, but the man is scared to say the words Palestinians. He's literally he's scared to say that. He's scared to say Palestine. And when you believe such a nonsensical thing, like if you have Muslims and Jewish people living in the same area, that it would mean the end of Israel or Israelis, that's ludicrous considering Palestinians had Jewish people living there and they were perfectly fine with each other before Israel became the state that it has become today, which is an apartheid state. So if you want to talk about evolution, then then we have to say that we have to give room for both people to evolve. And it didn't take Tulsi 50, 60 years to evolve or be great and then evolve and then kind of devolve and then kind of evolve again, I should say. That's Bernie in the 80s is not even comparable to Bernie in 2020. But if you're going to give room for Bernie to evolve, we have to give room for Tulsi to evolve, and we have to give credit where credit is due for evolving because she was presenting new information. And the last thing I'll say is we got to talk about the fact that when this new information about 9/11 was introduced, when all the families called every presidential candidate, including Bernie Sanders, only Tulsi Gabbard answered the phone. Only Tulsi. And they're just trying to hold the right people accountable, which is largely believed that it is Saudi Arabia, according to several court cases, including a federal court case here in Florida. But Bernie didn't answer that phone. So once again, why didn't he do it? Probably because it wasn't politically taboo to answer the phone when it comes to 9/11. But it turned out that it was just trying to hold the right people accountable. If he won't answer the phone for 9/11 families because it can hurt his political brand, then once again, you have the question if he has a conviction to pursue a foreign policy that means even when it's hard, doing the right thing.
Okay, we got about 3 minutes left in this segment, so Ben, I'll give you a chance to address some of the things that Niko's bringing up, but then we're going to move on to the audience Q&A.
Yeah.
So try to maybe address the things he's talking about instead of bringing up new topics or anything like that, all right?
Sure. So, real quick, first of all, I forgot to say earlier, Niko's explanation of Tulsi's self-description as a hawk on the war on terror, all due respect, just literally doesn't fit the plain meaning of the words that she used. It's not possible that she meant that, because she didn't say hawk on terror in the sense that I want there to be less terror, in the sense that the U.S. should stop funding terrorism. She said hawk in the war on terror. She knows what that means, just like she knows what it means when she talks about how the the best way to defeat the terrorists this 2012 was through strategically placed small quick strike special forces and drones. That's the kind of thing that she's talking about when she's talking about being a hawk on the war on terror. On her waffling on torture, it's not possible, given if you look at the actual words that she said, the explanation that she didn't read the report is just irrelevant. Doesn't matter whether she read the report. She's clearly waffling on torture. She says, and I quote, the jury is still out of the report itself, blah, blah, blah. But, and she pivots to the larger issue, as I think about it myself, clearly we would not like to see any person around the world being treated humanely. On the other side, I can also understand any of us if we're in a situation where our family, our community, our state, our country is in a place where, let's say, in an hour, a nuclear bomb or attack will go off unless information is found. I believe that we're the president of the United States. I would do everything in my power. So I have conflicted feelings on this. That is clearly waffling on torture. Even it doesn't matter. You could be right that she hadn't read the report, and she still would have been waffling on torture. Bernie Sanders
and her votes.
Finally, Finally, Niko, I didn't interrupt you, even though I was severely tempted to about 30 times. Finally, on the issue of, first of all, on the issue of introducing symbolic resolutions. Yes, I agree. Introducing the Medicare for All bill was symbolic. The point of getting people to co-sign on it was to force them to take a stand on it. And I'm sure Tulsi, in a much smaller way, because she is a much smaller political player, so people aren't going to pay as much attention to the stuff that she introduced, is trying to do the same thing, but signing on to it or not signing on to it is a symbolic issue. Clearly, she's bad on Medicare for All. She's what she's advocating sounds way more like Mayor Pete's public option. But finally, on Israel-Palestine, I agree. I am pro one-state solution too. That is something you and I agree on, and I guarantee you, not zero members of Congress. We have Rashida to leave now, but
Just
zero
finish up that last point, Ben.
Pre-2018 members of Congress agree on. Tulsi Gabbard has never said she supports a one-state solution, so that's totally irrelevant to the comparison. What is relevant to the comparison, if you want to talk about symbolic gestures, is when Bibi Netanyahu, blood-stained Israeli war criminal, came to address Congress to try to torpedo the Iran nuclear deal. And lots of Democrats boycotted it. Bernie Sanders was one of the first people to do so. Tulsi did not. So if you're going to bring up these various symbolic gestures that you seem to be fixated on, I'd say that one speaks volumes.
Okay, gentlemen.
Can I just say really quick?
Sure.
Tulsi was part of the Foreign Affairs Committee. It was literally her job to be there. So I should just probably say that. But go ahead.
Yeah, she still could have boycotted. Other people in Foreign Affairs boycotted. She had absolutely no obligation to.
All right, gentlemen, let's move on to the audience Q&A. They've got a lot of questions for both of you. So we're going to move on right into that. For each of these, I'm going to give, let's say, 1 minute and 30 seconds to answer, because some of them are directed in one way, some of them are directed in the other way. First one is to you, Niko House. Someone has said that Tulsi has had problematic positions in the past towards the gay community. She has since apologized and moved on. Is that enough? Should she be doing more? And I'll give you 1 minute and 30 seconds to answer that.
I mean, she was 21 years old when, the one statement that was made, or it's not even a statement, really. They're just questioning her position from when she was 21 years old. And shouldn't she be doing more? It's kind of, I don't know what else she could be doing except for introducing the Equality Act, maybe, like she did, where she introduced legislation to making sure that LGBTQ community members are actually protected by the civil rights amendments in the same way that I, as a black man, or another person as a woman, would be protected. That's what she did. So she has been doing more. But once again, the progressive community has been conveniently ignoring this reality because, many of them are in the tank, so to speak, for Bernie Sanders, which is fine. But just because you think that somebody is actually out progressiving, quote unquote, the person you support, doesn't mean you should ignore that legislation or ignore their feats. But in fact, you should be celebrating them, because I, as well as even Tulsi, would argue that Bernie has moved the needle left to such a degree, and the only reason he was able to do that is because we didn't pick and choose when we celebrated his progressive legislation. We just did it because it was the right thing to do. So she has been moved. She has been doing more. But it's, when we say have problems, let's be clear. Equal rights for marriage came maybe 5 years ago. Okay. Most of this country was homophobic, and I would still argue that unfortunately more than half still are. But what Tulsi did at 21 years old and complaining and acting like most of the country wasn't like that at 21, it's ludicrous. It is.
Okay, for you, Ben, what should a president do to stop the apartheid state of Israel from continuing the massacre of Palestinians, and why hasn't Bernie taken a hardline stance on this?
First of all, I agree with Niko about the previous answer. I think that even though it is to the credit of Bernie Sanders that as long ago as he was very pro-gay rights, and even...
Oh, no. Oh, man.
I mean, can you are you watching it, Niko? Can you see the freeze frame that it's frozen on right now?
Yeah.
He looks like a Tibetan monk. He looks so humble and peaceful.
Okay. What I was going to say is the main thing that I think that a U.S. president could do, or especially with the backing of a sympathetic Congress, which is obviously a whole other thing, but would be to cut off money and particularly cut off weapons. to Israel. Now, that might not be itself enough to stop it. I think we need to be real about this. In 1988, when George Bush Sr. did that, that was enough to get the Israelis to go to the Madrid peace talks. Today, the situation might have changed. They might just roll the dice on going on their own without all that U.S. support. But at least I think it would still be worth doing, right? Like if we can't stop them from committing these crimes, we can at least stop enabling the crimes. As to why the other half of the question was about why Bernie hasn't taken a harder line, I agree. Once again, this is a question where if you're comparing Bernie to Noam Chomsky, he sucks. If you're comparing him to the mainstream or even Tulsi Gabbard, he's pretty good.
Okay, thank you. Question for you, Niko. Niko, how do you explain Tulsi's relationship with Modi and the fact that she doesn't condone Modi's recent takeover of Kashmir, the Citizens Amendment for Modi's ties to the RSS?
I'm assuming that you mean condemn, not condone.
Yeah,
but
that is definitely.
So I won't presume to know the entire history of India, but I do know this. That resolution made it so that now gay people can get married in Kashmir. Now people who are Hindu can actually own land in Kashmir, whereas before, because Kashmir was basically ruled by Kashmiri oligarchs that have loyalties to Pakistan, that wasn't allowed. And most people would argue that who live in Kashmir, that Kashmir is better now than it would be in the past. So that's probably why she doesn't condemn the resolution that literally allows CQ members to get married. And, they basically puts them under the laws of India because they belong to India, technically speaking. That resolution was created because the former Lord, I want to say governor-ish of Kashmir, made a deal with the government of India at that time, and the contingency was, hey, we have to make sure that we get to live our lives because we have a mostly Muslim population, and you can't intervene. But we still want your help because Pakistan kept Pakistan, what we know as Pakistan today, just kept bombing the hell out of them. So they needed soldiers on the ground that only India could provide. So that resolution was actually, or the revocation, I should say, of that resolution was a good thing and not a bad thing. Although the mainstream media try to portray it as such. Now, as far as her quote unquote relationship with Modi,
10 seconds.
I don't know if you would call it a relationship. I would just say it's a diplomatic relationship based off of a cultural, association, but it isn't anything that's, that whole Hindu nationalism thing has been debunked already. And even Intercept admitted it was debunked.
All right. As always, we have an inordinate amount of joke questions compared to real ones, but of all the joke questions, the only one I'm actually going to entertain is this one to you, Ben Burgis. Is Tulsi to the left of Jack Bauer?
Yes, she is, because even though in that quote that I read earlier, she was using very Jack Bauer-ish arguments for the on the one hand, on the other hand for torture, but at least she had another hand, whereas Jack Bauer, was maybe breaking every finger on the other hand to extort an answer from somebody. I'd also add that Modi is a fascist. The occupation of Kashmir is very similar to the occupation of Palestine. It's a human rights catastrophe. It should not be both sides. And bringing up gay rights and other things sounds an awful lot like the typical Israeli rhetorical tactics of pinkwashing, talking about the persecution of gay people by Hamas, etc., to justify that occupation.
So since Ben went on a little bit of an attack there, Niko, do you want a minute and 30 seconds to respond to that directly?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, we've completely watered down the definition of the word fascist. The man got way more than of a majority of the votes than any U.S. president in history, first of all. So let's not pretend like he's a fascist. And also, that means the man that invented Yoga Day. Like, I don't know, fascism includes fear. It's like, it's authoritative in nature. And that is also not the case because their legislature actually has more power than their executive branch, unlike, unfortunately, our executive branch in compared to our legislature. I don't pretend to be like that. I like Modi or dislike him. I don't feel I don't feel any type of way, but this just seems to be the problem with progressives and neoliberals in general. We think that we can, bring the hammer down and insult instead of working with people like Modi or anybody that they perceivably disagree with, and they perceivably disagree with them based off of, once again, this idea that if the mainstream lodges some personal attack, not even like an issue-based attack, but a personal attack they don't ever take into account what I just said. They do have a legislation. Now, if you want to make an argument that the BJP, legislatively, I wouldn't agree with, like in that they're not progressive, you can make an argument for that. But is Bernie the same as every single Democrat in the legislature that he works with? Absolutely not. But do we assign everything that the Democrats do,
10 seconds.
and would we, to Bernie Sanders if he became president? Absolutely not. That would be ludicrous. And that's the same thing for Modi. But as far as Kashmir is concerned, I can't even entertain it because that's a whole different conversation, the rabbit hole to go down. But what Ben's saying isn't true.
Okay, we're getting to the end of the audience Q&A. I guess one final question that's been asked a couple of times, and I'll ask it to both of you, so I'll give you both 1 minute and 30 seconds on this. First to you, Ben, should Tulsi drop out and endorse Bernie Sanders? And why?
Yes, she absolutely should. The New Hampshire results speak for themselves. Bernie only beat intelligence community-loving, militaristic, dangerous Pete Buttigieg by a few thousand votes. Tulsi sucked away about 10,000 votes. She could have very easily been a spoiler there. She could very easily be a spoiler in other states. There's zero chance that she could win, as I think even most of her supporters would admit at this point, but an excellent chance that she could deliver the nomination to somebody who might invade Iran.
Okay, same question to you, Niko House, 1 minute and 30 seconds.
That's silly as hell. And I'm going to tell you why. For people who don't understand, Democratic horse trading is the norm in the Democratic Party. And because people thought it was smarter to attack Tulsi than to actually call out Warren for constantly waffling on, I don't know, everything, including her damn ethnicity, and call out and hold accountable the other people in the race more than they focused on the only other progressive ally in the race. Now you have a situation where people like to think it's, oh, well, Pete Buttigieg is only beating Bernie Sanders by 1 delegate, except for that's not the case. Because the establishment has a total of 41 delegates, and they will no longer be pulling out of the race because they're effectively beating Bernie Sanders, which would make it a contested convention because Bernie Sanders will likely not get the 51% if it keeps up at this pace. There's a lot of election integrity issues in California. We're finding out that the exit polling was way off in the metropolitan areas where the AccuVote machine was used in New Hampshire. And if people would have treated Tulsi as an ally instead of the enemy, which is the reason that we have to have debates like this one, then we would be in a different situation where I know for a fact, 100% for a fact, that Tulsi would have given her delegates, that a lot of which Bernie Sanders could not win for whatever reason, and given them to Bernie Sanders. And vice versa if it ended up where Tulsi bested him in a one-on-one situation. But now we have situations where Warren, Klobuchar, Biden, and Buttigieg all have delegates,
10 seconds.
And they will accrue more, especially coming into Super Tuesday, that Bernie Sanders will absolutely not get. And that was the whole reason they ran so many people. At the end of the day, the establishment is sticking together, and the progressive movement is to figure out, okay, there's the reason they're doing that, so maybe we should start doing the same.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to do closing arguments. Ben, because you started, you're going to go first. So we're going to put 5 minutes on the clock, and then we'll let Niko have the final 5-minute word.
All right. By the way, earlier I was asked a question I realized that I never answered, which was, when was this Bill Maher appearance? When Tulsi Gabbard mocked the suggestion that poverty played any role in causing terrorism. That was 2016. I have shared the link to the video with you, Niko, and you, Lance, in the Discord chat, so you can see that for yourself. Tulsi Gabbard is, by any reasonable standards, to the right of Bernie Sanders in most things, most certainly on foreign policy. She is, to use my favorite metaphor here, if you'll indulge me, the Flash. So I remember as a kid reading a Superman comic. I used to get 5 comics for $1 at the comic shop downtown. I'm really old, and one of them I remember reading this old comic. There was a race between Superman and the Flash, and Superman was winning. And I thought, wow, what's the point of the Flash? Right, the one thing he can do is run real fast, and here is Superman running faster than him. Tulsi Gabbard, with all due respect, even most people who like Tulsi are not familiar with the minutia of who's suggested what on election integrity and other issues that we've heard about today. Tulsi Gabbard is essentially a single-issue candidate on foreign policy, and on foreign policy, she is the Flash, and Bernie Sanders is Superman. You can see that on Kashmir. You can see that on Netanyahu. You can see that on torture waffling. You can see that in all the nonsense about radical Islamic extremism, and in and you can criticize both of them, but I think you can criticize her a lot more for all the reasons that I've laid out. But here's the thing: even if that was wrong, even if once you did the math and gave proper weight to every position either of them has ever taken or has taken since 2015, if we're going to play that game, even if it turned out that Tulsi was slightly ahead on foreign policy, that that the Flash was going to win this race, that wouldn't be enough to justify Gabbard's candidacy, because she can't win. She can deny Sanders the victory, which might be enough to throw the election to somebody who might start new wars that Bernie Sanders would not start, or to give her credit, that Tulsi Gabbard would not start. Now, on the issue of horse trading, what we just heard, I'm sure that it's sincere, but it's delusional. It's a fantasy. There is going to be no scenario where Tulsi gives her delegates at the convention to Bernie Sanders, because Tulsi is not going to have any delegates. Or if by some miracle she picks up a few here and there, we are not talking about anything that would matter if we get to a brokered convention. She can do exactly one thing to prevent the likes of Mayor Pete or Michael Bloomberg from getting the nomination, and that's drop out and endorse Bernie Sanders. And for the sake of the world and for the sake of the people who will die if one of those people is president instead of Bernie Sanders, she needs to do it very soon. The clock is ticking.
So let me just say this first. I find it funny that everybody is saying, oh, she should drop out and endorse Bernie Sanders after literally calling her a bigot, a homophobe. Not saying that you're calling her that, but many Bernie supporters have. They've asserted just the most horrific and horrendous thing that you could say about any progressive, but then they think her endorsement will somehow be beneficial towards Bernie and that they would want it associated with him. It's just super weird that that's the case. It's kind of ideologically inconsistent. But anyway, let's go ahead and use your Bernie Flash, analogy here, because Bernie is absolutely the Flash in this scenario, and it is actually Tulsi who is Superwoman, so to speak. Bernie is a one-trick pony, which is domestic policy, which would require him to get a lot of support in the legislature to do anything that he wants to do, except for some things here and there where he can do executive order, where he can use an executive order. But his foreign policy is absolute trash, and it's 70% of the job. If I went to a job and it's like, hey man, I know you said I have to be really proficient, and 70% of the job was nuclear engineering. I had to be proficient in that subject. But I'm really good at the 30% that requires data analytics and Microsoft Word processing. But I really suck at nuclear engineering. But it's cool, right? I can still apply for the job. You'll get laughed at. They will laugh at you. And essentially, Bernie Sanders doesn't have the foreign policy chops then or now, nor does he have the legislation to back that his evolution is somehow substantive. We didn't even get into Julian Assange. We didn't even get into his silence on Chelsea Manning. We didn't even get into his silence on Edward Snowden, but instead backing the whistleblower that led to the impeachment that is actually a CIA asset pretending to be a whistleblower. We didn't even get into that. But basically, Bernie has shown that he is fantastic on domestic policy. And that's where the buck stops. And his conviction is constantly in question, because when it comes to Julian Assange, when you want to make an entire video defending a CIA asset, pretending to be a whistleblower, and then once again, not speaking up for people like Chelsea Manning, who was literally been tortured and wrongfully put in jail over the last year, you do have to question his convictions in that regard. When you want to talk about Superwoman, who does have great domestic policy, once again, the OFF Act, the most aggressive climate change and environmental legislation ever introduced. 400 climate and environmental organizations have endorsed this. When you want to talk about election integrity, where she has open source blockchain technology that was so good that while she was in Miami, the Congress and the Senate tried to vote on it by introducing a bill that almost parroted the exact name, but made the substantive adjustments because they didn't want to see her legislation pass. When you want to talk about the evolution, not only evolution, but then the clairvoyance to say they're going to do anything. And then we see Soleimani assassinated. Then we see the tanker being attacked. Then we see the lies that Soleimani was responsible for thousands of U.S. deaths. So not only does she have the evolution, but then she has a clairvoyance that came from that evolution, learning from our history and saying this is exactly what they're going to do to start war, and not having to demonize a person one way or the other, just saying what we are doing and our part in this is wrong. Diplomacy comes before demonization. When you're talking about all the domestic issues, all the foreign policy issues, there's only one superwoman here, and Bernie essentially, for lack of a better word, because the man's old, although he was a long distance runner, but Bernie Sanders is instead the Flash, and even that, I would say Superman's probably in better shape to beat her, considering she's a walking 400 on her military PT test. And I will close with this. Tulsi Gabbard is very unique because she can say, I'm sorry. When she said she joined the military because of the war on terror, Ben is leaving out the part where she said multiple times, including on Joe Rogan's platform, that I joined the military based on a lie. And I don't want anybody else to do the same. What we saw in the Middle East was wrong, and it is wrong. And the only reason she's still in the military is because she's spending her time educating people on and trying her harder to prevent any other situation like Afghanistan or Iraq from happening again. So, but I do want to say I appreciate Ben for having a spirited debate, and Lance for providing this platform. This is actually one of the most fun debates that I've had, and I appreciate not getting personal and keeping it in good spirits.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. That was riveting. Why don't we do a quick little chance to do some shout outs? Ben, do you want to start?
Sure. So, see, you can. So I wrote a book called "Give Them an Argument: Logic for the Left." You can get that all the usual places. I am on the Michael Brooks Show every Tuesday night, doing a segment called The Debunk. I am a regular contributor to Jackman Magazine. You can see my stuff there, as well as Arc Digital Media. And if all that isn't enough for you, and you just need that much more content, there's also a Patreon where there are 2 original essays a week for the monthly cost of a milkshake and Pulp Fiction.
And you, Niko?
Once again, you can find me on Twitter at Niko, NIKOCSFB. You can find me on YouTube at Mika Says Sukastra, the MCSC Network, or you just Google my name, it'll come up. You can also find me on Rockfin at rockfin.com, ROKFIN.com/Niko, which is the creator co-op, where we get paid and don't get suppressed by the overlords at Google. So, but like I said, I appreciate the platform, and it was a fun debate.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.